Now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Lesa Mitchell is Vice President of Innovation and Networks at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation. The Kauffman Foundation was established in the 1960s by the late entrepreneur and philanthropist Ewing Marion Kauffman. Based in Kansas City, Missouri, the Kauffman Foundation is among the largest foundations in the United States with an asset base of approximately $2 billion. Their vision is to foster a society of economically independent individuals who are engaged citizens contributing to the improvement of their communities. In service of this vision, they focus their grant-making and operations on two key areas: education and entrepreneurship, of which Mr. Kauffman saw as two ends of a continuum. A quality education is the foundation for self-sufficiency, preparing young people for success in college and life beyond. Many young adults will work in businesses started by entrepreneurs. Some will become entrepreneurs themselves, providing jobs and wealth for society and their communities. Lesa's responsibilities at the foundation include identification of programmatic and policy levers that can accelerate innovation and support networks enabling firm growth. She was instrumental in the founding of the Kauffman Innovation Network, iBridge Network, the Translational Medicine Conferences in the United States and Europe, and the National Academies-based University Industry Partnership. She is also a leader in the replication of innovator-based commercialization and mentor programs across the United States. Lesa recently served on the board of Gazelle Growth in Denmark and is currently chairman of the Kauffman Fast Track Board. She is an advisory member of the National Science Foundation I Corporation and of Modern Meadow, Inc. Prior to joining Kauffman, Lesa spent 20 years of her career in global executive roles at Aventis and Quintiles, and she was an entrepreneur focused on the global management of electronic clinical trials. This afternoon, we are honored for Lesa to join us via video conference. Please join me in welcoming her as she shares best practices moving science to market wherever you are located.
I think it's apropos of the discussion today that I am joining you via modern technology that we have, especially because I think the beginning and the end of my talk is think global from the outset, and location doesn't matter. And hopefully there's a chart up in the room that's titled The Network Economy. And the reason for this chart, we at the Kauffman Foundation, as he said, have assets that allows us to fund a great deal of both research and programmatic initiatives across the country. Much of the research that we have funded over the last 10 years with the National Bureau of Economic Research has shown us the importance of networks and the importance of essentially thinking in a boundaryless way, which is very difficult, I know, when we're all struggling with funding at the level of a city, a state, and in many cases, a region. But what I hope that you garner from this slide is really the importance of thinking about, even at the level of a state, what your state looks like. We spend a lot of time at the Kauffman Foundation hosting about 80,000 people across the globe every year. And I literally always use this slide, even with leadership of places like Singapore and other countries, and say, this isn't a recipe. This is for you to look at and say, as I look at the resources, and I've listened to some of the talks before me today talking about understanding the assets that are available to you in your region, and that's so important, but it's equally important to understand the different assets and how they play different roles, whether they be startups in your community, big companies in your community that can become the first customers or part of the supply chain with startups, the role of government, whether that be through SBIR funding or some of the alternative funding models that I've heard talked about today. And then last but not least, the importance of the role of universities. And I would say, with deference to everyone that came before me, that I agreed with all of their talks, what we haven't talked about is why universities have become even more important in our economy than they were 20 and 30 years ago. 30 years ago and before, we had large research institutions like Bell Labs and others that frankly had huge research budgets, and they were doing a lot of the basic research. Fairchild Labs in California, I'm sure there were many in all states across the country. But what's happened over the last 20 to 30 years is as corporations have tightened up their business models and frankly become global, which is a different strain on them than they had previously, they, in the same process, have reduced much of their research funding and are looking to universities to play that role in the economy, providing some of the very basic research that's funded through the Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, NIH, and the national, all of the institutions in Washington. And so the role of the university is critical, but I would tell you that the most important lesson from this slide for us over the years has been when we first created this slide, and it was published in Foreign Affairs article in 2004, it had straight lines across the four actors of the economy. And it has since become obvious through our research on network theory that it is actually the porosity of the boundaries between all of the institutions in your economy that are extremely important. Whether that be the military facilities doing research, whether it be a Battelle or a large corporation or the universities in your backyard, the question is, how do the collaborative models work across all of those institutions, and how do we make them more seamless, less bureaucratic, yes, I'll say that, less bureaucratic, and allow, frankly, all actors, whether they be the immigrant population that's coming in that I heard someone speaking about, whether they be early young students, or whether they be, you know, our experienced individuals that are retiring that frankly in many cases are now starting second careers because they want to, and in some cases they have to, becoming a, you know, maker in their backyard, utilizing MakerBot technologies or the other software technologies and hardware technologies that are out there. So engaging all of those in our economy is important. So would you switch to slide 2 now? And so let me talk about, as I said, we have funded a great deal of research to understand what are the best strategies of moving science to market. And some of these, I would say, fall in the soft category, and some of them fall in the more discrete, we can understand them and we can replicate them category. As the person who introduced me just said, I'm on the founding board of the National Science Foundation I-Corps model, and the I-Corps model was frankly created based upon our lessons. We have been following what I would call either proof of concept or translational. It depends upon whether you're in the hard sciences, engineering, or life science fields. They call them different things, but frankly, they all mean the same, which is how do we take some of these really early stage basic research projects and move them along in a way before they have to be put into the for-profit world. So we call that de-risking them. How do we de-risk these models and the technologies before we have to move them to market? I've been working with the Despande Center at MIT, which I believe is celebrating its 9th anniversary this year, and von Liebig down at University of California, San Diego, the UCSF Mission Bay campus. The Kauffman Foundation has funded our own institution, proof of concept center at a much smaller institution, to prove the model that you can do it anywhere. And essentially the lessons from this are why we created and funded, along with Despande, the original NSF I-Corps program. And our interest in funding this program, and frankly, if I could wave a magic wand, I would create a similar program at both the the Department of Energy and the National Institute of Health, but I haven't been successful with my wand. But the lessons from all of those proof of concept centers and from the NSF I-Core program are the same. And the lessons are, if in fact we want to advance knowledge to the market, we need to do a couple of very critical things. One are, frankly, the decision making, and this is a case where these are very granular issues, but unfortunately very difficult to overcome. With the proof of concept centers and the translational centers that we've worked with, the successful ones have a couple of core elements. One is they have an advisory board of decision makers that are comprised of people that are not attached to the university. In all cases, they need to be successful industry leaders, entrepreneurs, or venture capitalists that don't necessarily have a stake in the technology, but have a deep knowledge of the marketplace and a deep knowledge of the competitive landscape in the marketplace. When we see these advisory boards in place, we see it happening in a much more proactive and positive way. And I can tell you, for the universities that we've worked with, I would, for the universities that are participating in this meeting, you should use this from your development office perspective as the opportunity to bring back to Dayton your successful alumni faculty, wherever they are in the world, to participate in this process. We've seen it work now at both large universities and small, and it actually works. The other component is you do need a level of seed funding, and you need a level of project management tied to these. Now, universities have not been known for project management. That's not what they've done. But what we found in every single one of these models is if there aren't people actually managing these projects to go, no-go decisions, the likelihood that they, A, don't meet timelines, and B, use a lot more money than they actually need is very high. And third, but not least, is the educational components that are required for the graduate students that are involved. And I will tell you that our lesson has absolutely been, and we've learned it most recently through a dissertation that was just defended at MIT, the role of the graduate students, frankly, are the most critical role in this process. It is not the faculty, it's the graduate students, because you have to have full-time dedicated resources moving this science to market. And so the educational program that we have put together and now exported essentially to the National Science Foundation through the I-Core program is being replicated across the country. There are 4 hubs now. We're not making these decisions. The National Science Foundation advisory team is making the decisions together about where they're replicating these educational modules. And these educational modules, frankly, have been put together on one of the new platforms, Udacity, the for-profit or the not-for-profit entity that Google has created, is the platform where we're hosting a lot of these educational modules. But the important component here is to hook up your graduate students with mentors and entrepreneurs in your community, get them the access to these educational components very early on in their project, because that's how they're going to start understanding their market and their customer. So I would say we have clearly understood what the model is. We published a report about 5 years ago, which was the economic return on investment analysis, retrospective analysis of a couple of the proof of concept centers. It's available on our website, and I encourage university leadership to carry it around along with their development office and look for alumni to help fund some of these programs. They're not cheap. The inroad to these programs, if you don't have the funding, is to apply to the NSF I-Core program. Any graduate student and or faculty member can apply with their project to the NSF I-Core program. And we've made sure that that program is pretty broad. As all of you know, if you're familiar with NSF, it is the broadest of all agencies and the type of technologies that it looks at. And as I said, we hope that we will soon, we're in our 2nd year of the program now, but that we will soon see the evidence of follow-on funding which at the end of the day was the third and final lesson of best practice of these types of institutions, is if you don't see for-profit follow-on funding, something's wrong. And I say that very specifically, and knowing that there's a lot of people that aren't going to like it, because frankly, government funding doesn't count when I say follow-on funding. It's the lesson we've learned from our friends in Israel over the years, of the early stage government fund that they created when they were instigating their technology economy. And those government dollars were never used to lead. They were always used to follow, whether it be corporate dollars or venture dollars, or any kind of what I would call non-tax funded dollars. And we've absolutely found with all of these programs that the metric should be the ability to bring in follow-on funding outside of necessarily your government or your university, and the ability, obviously, to either move the science to the market, which is a metric defined by licensing agreements done, or in the rare cases where one can actually do it, set up a startup company. I will tell you that there's a significant number of lessons that have helped us understand the problem of startups and the problem of focusing on jobs and startups as a metric. There's a long history with a number of states going back 10 or 15 years where the governors were very interested in focusing on startups. And so this became a metric, and unfortunately skewed a lot of the outcomes of the university more towards being interested in creating a startup, frankly, no matter what. And what we have found in retrospect is in many of those cases, we actually killed technology that could have otherwise lived. And what I mean by that is, if we force the startups to happen when actually there was a company that you could license this technology to and it could make its way to market, many times you can't keep up with the competition of the big co in some cases, but more importantly, if there's not a local management team that can take it on, you shouldn't start the company, because you're probably not ultimately going to get follow-on funding. And we have found significant lessons of essentially, especially on the life science side, using the intellectual property life of a product for so long, trying to work in a startup, that ultimately when you realize it's not going to work anymore, nobody's willing to take it. At the Kauffman Foundation, we call those startups our walking dead. And we should all be motivated to have as few walking dead as possible. And I think I've learned from this work that in working with the universities, when there is the question about how do I know if I should do a startup or if I should license this technology out, the answer actually should be, and if you work with the more experienced offices, you'll hear this, is I do a startup when I have no other choice, simply because there isn't anybody to license it to. If in fact, and I'll explain that again back to the funding cycle, if in fact there is a choice to license, you can clearly create a more sustainable model for your proof of concept center and translational center by bringing those licensing dollars in to pay for other projects. And it's a much shorter term win. If ultimately down the road you can start building out startups with management teams, that's a great thing. But frankly, you shouldn't measure it that way, I don't think. You should be measuring it based upon, are you actually moving the science to the market, measured by licensing deals or measured by follow-on funding. And second, how do we utilize programs and networks to enable growth of these entrepreneurial ecosystems? I realize that's a focus of the discussion here today. And I would tell you the important component, I spend my time traveling all over the world and talking to people in different ecosystems. And again, this brings me back to networks. It's extremely important that you figure out how to bring, whether it's immigrants or industry or entrepreneurs, how do we bring people into our ecosystem that are from outside of our ecosystem? I mean, the successes of a vibrant, rich entrepreneurial ecosystem are very much tied to what the economists call flux. and that's the incoming of new people into your economy as measured by US Census data, and outcoming people of your economy. Both are important because they're bringing, frankly, new blood, brings new networks into your system. We published a report about a year ago. It was highlighted in Forbes magazine, and literally there's a map that you can click on your region. You can click on every county in your region to see where are people leaving that are going from your community, where are they going to, and where are the people that are coming in, where are they coming from? And that's the networks that they're bringing in and out of your community. So the more that we can encourage bringing diversity of types of people, young, old, immigrants, non-immigrants into our economy, we can clearly tell from both our city and our state data. You show me diversity in an economy and a high level of outcoming and incoming traffic, and we'll show you an economy that's rich with growth. We also know that enabling activities that can instigate the collaborations, and I'll give you I've spent many years of my life in the regenerative medicine business, and I will tell you that a fact of much of these new technology areas is that they happen by accident or serendipity. Literally, the very first technology licensed out of MIT and Harvard that became the first company that went public in this space happened because the right engineer and the right Harvard doc sat on an airplane together on a trip between Boston and San Francisco and talked about their science. And so the encouragement that I would provide to you is coming to meetings like this is important. Getting new knowledge is important, but actually what's the most important is what's going to happen in the hallway when all of you go outside. And are we enabling those kinds of meetups and those collaborations between our university leadership, between our graduate students at the universities, the individuals that want to hire them at the companies, and as I said, all levels of the population, and what are the kinds of activities and programs. If you go to the Kauffman Foundation website, we have examples of a ton of different programs that we've funded, seed funded, and are growing across the country, if not across the globe, that enable some of these things to happen. Startup Weekend is a perfect example, and Startup Weekend is predominantly in the Web 2.0 space and the digital health. But I can tell you in both circumstances, last year there were 750 Startup Weekends around the world, and my concern is that the greatest growth is outside the United States, not in. Many big companies, Microsoft, Google, et cetera, host Startup Weekends at their offices in hopes that they can bring entrepreneurs, scientists, et cetera, from the community to bring ideas together, get the experiential opportunity of moving science to market. So the moral of the story that I'm delivering to you, I hope, is that there are lessons. We have data, we have reports that we can give you, but in many cases, some of this isn't rocket science. And it goes back to my slide one, which is how do we create more porous boundaries between the universities, between the big companies, the startups, and those in our government agencies that have funding, have science, have technology, that needs customers, that needs to be part of a supply chain. There isn't a one-size-fits-all recipe. There are models that you can replicate, but I would encourage you to think global from the outset, realize what you've been talking about today, to collect your assets and understand how you can work those in your economy, but bring as many people from outside your ecosystem into your ecosystem and encourage as many people in your ecosystem to go out so that you do encourage this constant churn of new ideas, new linkages between the scientist and the engineer that could develop a new technology, and if at all possible, link into some of these programs that are out there, in many cases very inexpensive to run and easily accessible. So I appreciate for the opportunity, as I said, to present to you. I have no idea what it looks like from your end. You guys look great. And your location looks beautiful. I would love to take questions, but I'm guessing that's probably too difficult. So I would ask you, my email is lmitchell@kauffman.org. Anyone that wants to email me, ask for reports, ask for anything that I've talked about today, I am always on, and feel free to follow me at Lesa Mitchell. I travel around the world and collect best practices, and if you're on Twitter, you can catch them anytime. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Lesa. We know your speaking engagements and conferences keep you moving, and we appreciate the time you made in your schedule to share your insights today.